Again, Chris Lee and Chase Robinson here, continuing our series of SEC schedule previews. Today we get to the Ole Miss Rebels. Chase, Ole Miss has got an interesting slate. On one hand, it is one of the easier slates in the SEC this year. Easier always being relative because it's the SEC. There's never an easy schedule. But on the other hand, Ole Miss is gunning for a playoff berth this year. I think anything less than that would be a disappointment in Oxford. And certainly probably going to be a little less tolerance for some losses with the schedule the Rebels play compared to some of the other teams. It's going to be very interesting to see how Ole Miss handles the expectations and how it handles the schedule.
Yeah, it really is, and it's one of those years, playoff or bust for Ole Miss. We talked before we got on here, and we're curious what strength of schedule will play into what the committee does for the 12-team playoff. That's been a big part of, I think, some years of who got in the 14 playoff and who didn't. And so we're curious of what tolerance they have for strength of schedule heading into the playoff. I think that's going to be interesting to see because that could play into a team like Ole Miss. Some teams I think could lose one or two games, still make the playoff. With Ole Miss, with the schedule that they have, will that be the case? Well, we'll have to see.
Before we get into the schedule, reminder, it's brought to you by BetOnline, your number one source for all your summer sports this season, from MLB, golf, the NBA, and NHL playoffs. All the latest stats, news, and scores available to follow your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds on just about every sport out there. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. BetOnline, the game starts here. All right, let's take a look at the Ole Miss schedule. I'm going to pull that up. I know the Rebels are going to start with Furman, an FBS team that went 10-3 last year, so not one of the cakewalk FBS games that FCS opponents that you might see on some schedules. But at the same time, hey, who are we kidding? If this is a game or a Furman upset, then we could pretty much scrap all playoff talk right there.
Yeah, this is a game, Ole Miss, it'll be the opener. They are really excited about this season, and so I think this is a chance for them to go out and put kind of a start the season with an exclamation point and show people what their hopes and dreams are this season. So, like you mentioned, this is not a bad team, but I think Ole Miss is going to want to go out there and really show the world that, hey, we are for real, put us in the playoff talk. And I think they can do that with putting some big numbers up against Furman. And you think about the first two games of the season, against Middle Tennessee State the following week. Derek Mason, former Vanderbilt head coach, now at Middle Tennessee. We'll see what he can do there. But I think these first two games are really good games to fine-tune everything before you get into the rest of the year, before you get into SEC play. And so you get both of those in Oxford, Mississippi. And so I think it's a good first two games for the Rebels to see kind of where they're at.
Yeah, week 2, Middle Tennessee State, not a familiar opponent for the Rebels. They last played in 2000. That's their only meeting. Ole Miss won that one, I think, 45-17. But as you mentioned, Derek Mason, former Vanderbilt coach, will be on the sidelines of that one. I'm kind of keeping together some power rankings based on some 1 to 134 ratings. I'm using Lindy's, Athlon, SP Plus, ESPN, some of those, and MTSU checks in at number 117 of 134 as we do this in the summer. I'll add some more as we get them, Phil Steele and some others, but wouldn't expect Middle Tennessee State to budge far from that number. So again, should be a 2-0 start. Up next, Wake Forest, a team that's been tricky at times, but seems, it seems like some of Wake's better days are maybe a little bit in the rearview mirror. Wake expected to be kind of a middle of the pack FBS team this year. That the power rankings that I'm putting together have got them at 74. So again, should be a case. And Wake can be tricky offensively at times with that slow mesh offense it runs, but you would expect the Rebels to be 3-0 after this one.
Yeah, I think so. And this will, I think, be the biggest challenge in the first 4 non-conference games. But still, how much of a challenge it's yet to be seen. But yeah, this is an interesting matchup, that this is their kind of their big non-conference game, if you will. You think of some of the other Georgia starts off with Clemson, Alabama is up at Wisconsin. Auburn has Cal, and and this is kind of the bigger non-conference game for Ole Miss and Wake Forest. So we talked about their schedule. I think that's a good draw in a big non-conference game, having Wake Forest.
Yeah, one thing you'll note of the schedule, all 4 of the non-SEC games are right off the bat. Next one, Georgia Southern, which is around 102 in this thing I'm putting together. So again, another game where the Rebels will be heavily favored, and another night game here.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned the 4 non-conference games are our first 4 games of the year, and so again, they'll have a chance to kind of fine tune everything, get ready for the SEC portion of things. But yeah, four straight non-conference games, 3 of them at home. I think that's really good for Ole Miss.
Next up, Kentucky, SEC opener for the Rebels. This be nice and hot at an 11 o'clock kickoff, which I know all the fans really love those when it's just baking in the third and fourth quarter. Actually, be baking at 11. What do we make of this one, Chase?
And I want to point this out really quick. The reason I asked Chris to pull this graphic up was to show the game times, because I think it's really interesting for Ole Miss. We have an 11 o'clock here against Kentucky. And then the Oklahoma, Arkansas are both early kicks, Florida's early kicks, and then there's a couple of flex. Now, imagine the Ole Miss Georgia game is not going to be an 11 a.m. game. It'll probably get the night or the afternoon, but I could see Ole Miss South Carolina being the early time slot. So that's a lot of early games for the Ole Miss Rebels, which really surprises me, especially looking at everybody else's windows. They didn't get this many early games. So that's interesting to me. Maybe it's because of the schedule. I don't know. But this Kentucky matchup specifically, you mentioned it's an early kick. It's in Oxford, Mississippi, which I think is good because this has been a tricky matchup for Ole Miss over the years. And now I don't think Kentucky is the Kentucky team that they were maybe 3-4 years ago. But I still think this is a pretty good team. We still are figuring out what they are with Brock Vandergriff. But this has been a tricky matchup for Ole Miss in the past. Very winnable game, especially it being at home in the first conference game. But Kentucky's going to want to try to spoil what Ole Miss thinks is going to be a playoff season. So this could be an interesting conference matchup right off the bat, Chris.
Yeah, last time these teams played, 2022, Ole Miss won that one 22-19. The previous matchup was 2020. Ole Miss lost that one, won that one in Lexington 42-41. And the game before that, 2017, was a 37-34 game. So the last 3 games have been super entertaining when these teams have hooked up. All right, next up, as we get halfway through the schedule, South Carolina in that flex spot coming up on October the 5th. So this will be what? That'll be, 6 straight weeks out of the gate with the ball game for the Rebels.
Yeah, and we talk about the schedule for Ole Miss and how it appears to be one of the relatively easier schedules in the conference. But I think this is one of the more tricky games on the schedule for Ole Miss, having to go to Columbia, South Carolina. That's a tough place to play. We've seen a lot of teams fall there in Columbia. So this is a October 5th matchup. You've got some games under your belt, but you haven't seen really, really good competition at this point. We don't think. Not to discredit any of the other teams, but you're coming off a game with Kentucky. You really learned a lot about your team in the previous week. But this South Carolina game, to me, is tricky for Ole Miss, having to go to Columbia. Again, it's a matchup with South Carolina being a former East team, Ole Miss being a former West team that we haven't seen a ton of in the past. But I think this could be a tricky game for the Rebels there on the road, especially with 2 straight road games. We'll look at the other one in a minute, but 2 straight road games, first one being Columbia, South Carolina. It could be tricky for the Rebels.
Yeah, these are not 2 teams that play a lot. They played in 2009 with South Carolina winning 16-10. Next time didn't play till 2018. That's a incredibly long gap. And then, of course, 2020, the last matchup, Ole Miss won that 51-42. All right, another game out of the gate without a break at LSU. This is a night game. I think this will absolutely be one of the key games of the Rebels season, and probably for LSU also.
I really think so. This could be a make or break game for both teams, really, because I think LSU has their eye on the playoff too. And I think if their defense is better than it was last year, they very well could be, a top 5 SEC team and maybe in the playoff. And so this could be a huge game for both. It's going to be tough traveling to Baton Rouge again, like it says there, a night game. We've seen some really entertaining games between these two as of late. Last year, Ole Miss got the win 55-49, but we've seen some absolute shootouts between Ole Miss and LSU the last couple of years. Two really good offenses, and I think this could be an excellent game, middle of the season, but one of the most important games, like you mentioned, I think, for both teams, because Ole Miss does have Georgia coming up. They do have Oklahoma. Those will be two challenging games. So if you're Ole Miss, you've got to get a win here if you want a shot at the playoff. So it could be definitely make or break on October the 12th there in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, finally a bye week, and then Oklahoma comes to town on the 26th. And I think that's going to be one of the more fun matchups of the year. Both teams expected to be, I guess a good way to say their bread will be buttered probably more on offense than defense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And at this point, I think Oklahoma will be in a pretty good spot as well heading into this game. So let's see. They'll be coming off. Oklahoma will be coming off a game with South Carolina before they go to Oxford, Mississippi, Texas the previous week. So they will have played a gauntlet of an SEC schedule up until this point, because they have Tennessee, at Auburn, Texas, South Carolina, and then Ole Miss. Oklahoma does. So that's a tough start to their SEC schedule, and so they're going to have some. They're going to be battle tested heading into this one. So that'll be interesting to see how Oklahoma handles this going into Oxford, Mississippi. But again, this could be a very important game, and I think this is a good time for an off week heading in between LSU and Oklahoma to have a chance to have a breather. I think could be really big.
Yeah, another early kickoff the next week in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Sam Pittman will kind of be on the hot seat coming into this year. Weather should cool off by that point, so you want to have one of those 92-degree kickoff things that we all love and appreciate with those early kicks. So this would be an interesting one to see where Arkansas is at that point of the season, and the Razorbacks will have played at Mississippi State and LSU the two prior weeks.
Yeah, this is a game we really don't know where Arkansas will be at this point. We really don't know what to expect from the Razorbacks really heading into the season, much less at this point of the year in November. So, this is a game. Ole Miss, if they are as expected, this should be a win for the Rebels. But again, the two previous conference games are going to be brutally tough, and then you make it South Carolina that on the road, and that's also very tough. So, if there's a couple of losses for Ole Miss, where is their head at this point coming into this matchup with Arkansas? But if they're smooth sailing and haven't lost a game, then I think this could be another week that Ole Miss just rolls on. But it's I think this game may depend kind of on what has happened in previous games.
Yeah, November 9th should be one of the biggest games in Oxford probably in decades. I mean, you can maybe circle some of those Alabama contests, but let's be honest, Ole Miss most years not in the 14 playoff, a contender getting this point with a 12-team playoff, a little more leeway for grace. I would say Ole Miss, if it can win this one against Georgia and Oxford, that'll be a sign of a lot of things, including probably a go ahead and punch your tickets for a playoff berth, barring a collapse the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, if Ole Miss is what we think they are, what I think they are, I think they will have not lost a game at this point heading into the Georgia matchup, which again, I think Georgia will be in the same boat. I think this will be kind of the game of the year, one of the games of the year in the SEC, because the winner is going to be in the driver's seat. If things go the way Ole Miss wants it, would they have a shot at Georgia again in the SEC championship if both teams are there? even with a loss. It's hard to see how that's going to play out with the other teams competing in the SEC, but this should be a great matchup. Now, we're still waiting to see that really big win for Lane Kiffin. He's had some good wins, but we're waiting really for that big breakthrough win for Kiffin. This could be it. This could be it for him if he was able to beat Georgia in Oxford, Mississippi, and I think that would definitely propel Ole Miss and give them a lot of confidence heading into the postseason.
Yeah, next up, a bye week. And then this is kind of interesting. Florida should be a game that Ole Miss should win, but it's on the road, and the power rankings of God is Florida's the fourth toughest game Ole Miss has got this year, according to those. No, do I believe that? Not necessarily, but I'm just going to tell you what's out there. And of course, this would be a very interesting time for Billy Napier. He may or may not still be the coach at Florida at this point, or maybe about to not be the coach potentially, depending on how this one goes. But an 11 o'clock kickoff in Gainesville, in a very interesting spot where Ole Miss will need to avoid a letdown here.
Right. That's I think one of the biggest things there. And with there being an off week, I think will help that case. But you go into the swamp, crazy things can happen. And, I think a lot depends on where Florida's at, what has happened to them, what's the situation with Billy Napier, what's their record heading into this game? Are they still, have they given up? Are they still fighting? All that I think will play big into a late November matchup with these two teams. But anytime you go into the swamp, and maybe they're playing with a lot of heart at this point, you see some teams that maybe things haven't gone their way, but they see a team that they can spoil chances on. Well, that Florida could play the spoiler here. So I think this is a game that Ole Miss definitely has to be ready for, especially with being on the road.
And then one of the biggest rivalries in college football, maybe not one of the more publicized nationally, but certainly one of the more heated ones, the Egg Bowl, Ole Miss and Mississippi State. This one is in Oxford. Rebels, according to Mississippi State's website, lead this series 67-46-6. Last time out, Ole Miss won 17-7 against a very offensively challenged Mississippi State team the year before. State won that one, followed by 2 Ole Miss wins the previous year. I think we remember what happened in 2022. I think that was the year where you had the crazy ending. But in any case, always big when these two teams play. I think Jeff Lebby will have gotten his feet underneath him in what is going to be a little bit of a tough rebuild this year. But this one always fun to watch.
It is. Rivalry games are like that. I mean, and it always causes some interesting games. And I think this one will be too. What will State be at this point? What will Ole Miss be at this point? I think it doesn't matter in a game like this. It's a rivalry game. It's an afternoon game this year. They've typically played this, on Thanksgiving. I think they've moved it off of Thanksgiving to Black Friday. But still, I think this is going to be a really fun game. It always is. Throw out the records really with any rivalry game. And I think that's the situation here. And again, Ole Miss has got to win this one. We've said this a lot. They've got to win this one if they want a shot at the playoffs because of the teams they faced in the last month. So I think this will be big for Ole Miss to get a nice propel into the postseason if they can win this one.
My apologies. 2019 was the game that I was thinking of.
That's
with
right.
The interesting leg lift celebration. I'll just leave it at that. And of course, the last time these two teams played in Oxford, that was Mike Leach's last game, as everybody remembers, in a tragic, what would soon be a tragic ending to his career. But yeah, Chase, looking forward to seeing the Rebels this year, especially that game at LSU, that game with Georgia. Two very interesting tests to see if the Rebels have arrived at the place where I think their fans hope the program has arrived at heading into the season. And not just the fans, a lot of national pundits too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about Ole Miss. Can they live up to that? I think they have the roster, the talent to do that. Jackson Dart, a third-year quarterback. Lane Kiffin has never had a third-year quarterback. I think that will help them tremendously heading into this season. But it should be a fun year for the Ole Miss Rebels.
We'll be here to cover it. We're doing this schedule preview in around mid-June. So in case something has changed here, just know that. But we will be here to cover the Rebels wall to wall during football season, also basketball and baseball season. So hope you will join us. Subscribe to our channel. That's easy to do and it's free. For Chase Robinson, I'm Chris Lee. We are Southeastern 14, presented by Bet Online.